The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
Taiwan, a vital hub in the production of semiconductors and in international supply chains. An important global partner in trade and investment, science and technology, it is also a potent symbol of democratic values. To discuss the ROC's significance from a variety of perspectives, including security architecture and how the rest of the world relies on stability across the Taiwan Strait, join our live debate, bringing your questions and challenges for a panel of international experts. The event will broadcast live on all social media platforms of the Democracy Forum, on Tuesday 26 July 2022, 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. UK time.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next 2 hours on this fascinating Democracy Forum debate to discuss what could be the most pivotal international issue of our time, the future of Taiwan, that stubborn, innovative, clever island of 25 million people in the heart of Asia, which operates as a self-contained state, with internationally recognized passports, borders, a tax system, and so on, except a Taiwanese citizen cannot step inside a United Nations building, because China claims Taiwan as a rebel breakaway territory that needs to be brought back into the fold of the motherland. There is a constant threat of invasion, yet China-Taiwan trade is massive, as is their technology industry. If they did fight, our whole Wi-Fi system would collapse, and that would skew the world order. If a solution can be found, it would be a great victory for world peace. If there is a conflict, it risks sparking a full global war. To debate this complex issue, we have a deeply knowledgeable panel. Siaru Shirley Lin, James Lee, Chun-Yi Lee, Simona Grano, Raymond and Shelley Rigger. Summing up will be the Democracy Forum Chair Barry Gardner MP, a veteran of the nuances and balances of international politics. But first I go to Democracy Forum President, Lord Charles Bruce, to lay out the canvas for our debate. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Humphrey. In recent months, several Democracy Forum webinars have considered the circumstances and the likelihood of Taiwan confronting a military challenge to its continuing self-determination. Our panel meeting in November last year concluded that the diplomatic language between China and the United States presaged many of the conditions necessary to believe that not only had a Cold War started, but also that it is now possible to discern a tangible threat to the existing world order. Our webinar today has been convened against a backdrop of rising tension and intimidation in the Taiwan Strait, and I commend the Forum for continuing its focus on this vitally important issue for global security and stability, and for inviting such an eminent panel to discuss its ramifications. As ever, I'm delighted that Humphrey Hawksley has agreed to chair the proceedings and grace the event with his reassuring presence. In trying to reach a clearer understanding of the perception of a military threat to Taiwan, a blunt assessment was aired in March last year by retired American Admiral Phil Davidson, former head of US Indo-Pacific Command. He told the Senate Armed Forces Committee that a Chinese attack on Taiwan would manifest in the next 6 years. And speaking in October last year, Taiwan's Defense Minister Chiu Kung-chang tightened the sense of urgency, expressing his government's belief that the People's Liberation Army would have the complete capability to attack Taiwan by 2025. The current situation is really the most dangerous I've seen in more than 40 years in the military, he said. Chinese military intentions with respect to its defensive posture in the Taiwan Strait were on full display at the International Institute for Strategic Studies annual Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore last month. Leading the Chinese delegation, the Defense Minister Wai Fenghe spoke unequivocally when he responded to the remarks which President Biden made in Tokyo on the 23rd of May, when he appeared to suggest that the United States would engage militarily to defend Taiwan. Wai warned the United States, "If you want confrontation, we will fight to the end," he said. And writing in the Guardian newspaper shortly afterwards, the defense analyst Stephen Wertheim suggests that Biden's vow to defend Taiwan risks conveying that the United States is degrading the long-standing policies that have preserved peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And covering the dialogue for the Brookings Institute, Ryan Haas described the proceedings as the closest thing to an X-ray of the strategic situation in the Indo-Pacific. He later condensed his reflections in a paper published earlier this month. It will be important for American policy to be guided by consistent precepts, including the principle that the United States supports Taiwan for its own sake and not as a tool for harming China. Indeed, President Biden's visit to Tokyo marked the growing maturity of the Quad Security Pact, which was established 18 years ago, and gave him the opportunity to launch the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Writing in the July edition of Asian Affairs magazine, our sister publication, Nicholas Nugent comments on the Quad's role, concluding that China's expansionist tendencies has made it increasingly relevant, rather as Russia's invasion of Ukraine has given new vitality and purpose to NATO. And he added, while the Ukraine crisis is preoccupying minds in Europe, many countries still see China as the greater long-term threat to Asian stability. In April this year, President Xi launched the Global Security Initiative at the World Forum in Asia as a deliberate attempt to prevent America from growing or sustaining its regional hegemony. The Economist magazine concluded that President Xi's speech was a codified attempt to delegitimize the American-led defense alliances and treaties that have guaranteed their security for decades. And in a video address to foreign ministers representing the BRICS group of emerging economies, President Xi pointedly criticized the United States and its allies and exhorted his audience to oppose hegemonism and power politics, reject Cold War mentality, and block confrontation. Attending the meeting of NATO heads of government in Madrid in early July, the first time a Japanese prime minister has attended such an event, Fumio Kishida explained that the presence of Japan, along with New Zealand, Australia, and South Korea, demonstrated that the security of Europe and the Indo-Pacific is inseparable. Last week, the Japanese government published its annual white paper on defense spending, warning of escalating national security threats. including repercussions from Russia's war with Ukraine, China's intimidation of Taiwan, and vulnerable technology supply chains. China was quick to criticize the white paper. Wang Weibin, a foreign affairs spokesman, urged the Japanese government to immediately stop the erroneous practice of exaggerating security threats in its neighborhood and finding excuses for its own strong military arsenal. But concerns about the impact on the world economy as a result of a military strike against Taiwan are growing. Taiwan currently dominates the global market for semiconductor manufacturing, particularly the most advanced chips. A recent survey conducted by the Financial Times concluded that although the threat of military escalation is considered marginal by specialist risk managers, certainly less than 20%, the prospect of sanctions imposed as an economic weapon to deter aggression is considered to be much more likely. In either scenario, a concerted plan to reduce the vulnerability of Western trade and manufacturing is already underway in the United States and the European Union. Only last week, a key Senate committee agreed to fund a $52 billion plan to boost American semiconductor manufacturing, perhaps prompted by the news that Intel is planning to spend $35 billion on expanding its manufacturing capacity in several European member states. And speaking at a conference in Aspen at the beginning of July, the chief executive officer of Intel, Pat Gelsinger, challenged the United States to raise its share of global production of chips from 12 to 30%. It's unavoidable, perhaps, that bellicose rhetoric is appearing to dominate the language of diplomacy. Taking a longer view, the seasoned China analyst Charles Parton suggests that despite the intentional posturing of the Chinese Communist Party on the fate of Taiwan, war or forceful unification will not happen in the foreseeable future, he writes. And he concludes that the risks and costs of failure are simply too great for the Chinese Communist Party realistically to countenance. Well, I look forward with great interest to hearing our panelists' views. And if any of you have any questions or queries, please put them to the panel through our moderator, Humphrey Hawksley.
Lord Charles Bruce, thank you very much. And for ending with Charles Parton on a slightly upbeat note after talking about attack in the next 6 years, capability to attack in 2025, and the bellicose rhetoric, which is becoming familiar to us all. Taiwan, is it the key to the continuing world order? Opening our debate is Sierra Shirley Lin, Compton visiting professor in world politics at the University of Virginia, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and an adjunct professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. She is also the founder of the Center for Asia-Pacific Resilience and Innovation, in which capacity she is currently in Taiwan, and she is now going to spell out exactly why Taiwan matters to the world. Professor Shirley Lin, tell us what you know.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's really a pleasure to be speaking on this distinguished panel of experts on Taiwan, which happens to be where I am currently located. When I learned about today's topic, I also saw that this panel already has excellent experts like Shelley and Chun-Yi, my good friends, to address Taiwan's geopolitical sensitivity and the importance of its semiconductor industry. Today, I would like to offer a different perspective, how Taiwan matters because of what it can contribute to the world in enhancing democratic governance as well as societal resilience, and how Taiwan needs support from the world as it faces domestic structural issues that are even more threatening than China. Hello? Oh. Taiwan's miraculous economic and political transformation into a wealthy, vibrant democracy over the last few decades tells quite the success story that can be shared with the world. But despite its successes, Taiwan and other high-income societies in the region face complex structural problems that will threaten their resilience to future crises, both predictable and unexpected. This is why during the pandemic, several international and Taiwanese colleagues and I set up a global nonpartisan think tank called the Center for Asia-Pacific Resilience and Innovation, or short for CAPRI. Because Taiwan has been isolated from the international community for so long, CAPRI is actually the first international NGO to be established in Taiwan since 1979. It is designed to research these issues that many societies face. The most prominent of these structural problems I have observed in Taiwan are what I call the 5 Ps. The first one is population decline, followed by power generation, political polarization, parochialism, and of course, the pandemic. These issues are at the forefront of people's minds in Taiwan, perhaps even more so than the threat of armed conflict with China. Moreover, they are testing the resilience of societies around the world. There is no quick fix for these structural challenges. They need dedicated, sustained engagement with decision makers across sectors, across disciplines, to develop policy solutions that will enhance resilience in societies around the world, in Asia Pacific and elsewhere. Taiwan and the region must cultivate talented researchers and leaders who will be able to manage these complex and multidimensional challenges. Of these challenges, one of the easiest to measure but hardest to address is population decline, which is happening in many high-income societies, but is a particular challenge in Taiwan, as Taiwan's per capita income surpassed $33,000. The population is shrinking, and its fertility rate was ranked last out of 227 countries and regions last year. As a result, Taiwan's workforce is expected to shrink by half to only 8.6 million people by 2065, which will be insufficient to support the pensions and healthcare of the growing retiree population as life expectancy increases. Thus far, government policy has rarely, if ever, successfully increased birth rates. And the only real alternative, which is expanding immigration, is forcing societies like Taiwan to consider whether they wish to become more ethnically and culturally diverse. Long-term solutions to population decline require a strategic rethinking of how our economies and societies are structured, as people have fewer children and live longer than ever before. Second, developing more sustainable power generation is urgently needed. It is an ongoing issue in Taiwan with great controversy. Renewable energy comprises only about 5% of Taiwan's energy mix, and the island is still relying mostly on coal, natural gas, and oil for its energy needs. The petrochemical and electronic industries responsible for Taiwan's economic miracle remain the drivers of Taiwan's economy, but are also its main energy consumers, carbon emitters, and water users. Moreover, the transition to renewable energy is a contested and controversial political topic with disagreement among stakeholders on all sides over issues ranging from nuclear energy, electricity pricing, conservation, and many other competing agenda. High economic growth on the back of carbon-emitting industries means the progress toward a green economy will stagnate unless traditional economic models are transformed to prioritize sustainable industries. Third, political polarization is occurring in Taiwan and in other democracies around the world, as we see between, of course, and within political parties. We need not look further than Boris Johnson's recent resignation to know that political factionalism both reflects and creates instability and dissatisfaction. Excuse me. So,
are you there? No, this is fascinating.
Yes. Sorry, I'm losing the camera. Okay, here we are.
Okay.
Yes, I can see. Just give me a second to return to my spot.
Yeah, we were just on Boris Johnson's polarization.
That's why I stopped on purpose.
Wrap up with that thought, but finish, please. Yes.
Yes. We need not look further than Boris Johnson's recent resignation to know how important and devastating this could be. The last few decades, of course, have seen Taiwan transform into a vibrant, progressive, participatory democracy. It was the first society in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage. Apologize, can I ask how much time has passed?
You're about 10 minutes, so you've got another minute or so.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So if you want to wrap and give us a conclusion and then come back with some other points later on, perhaps. Yeah.
Yes. It has, of course, it is very progressive and has the highest percentage of women in parliament in East Asia. Voter turnout for the 2020 presidential election reached nearly 75%. But political polarization could undermine democratic engagement. Tools intended to find consensus, such as referenda, could devolve into weapons to discredit policies associated with political opponents. In Taiwan and other democratic societies, factionalism is thwarting consensus building and meaningful dialogue on important issues. This is why evidence-based research transcending the election cycle is so crucial, especially in a region like the Asia Pacific, where there are few independent, nonpartisan think tanks working on issues of governance. And this is why it's very important for Taiwan to have a think tank that is nonpartisan. And lastly, Taiwan continues to be quite parochial. It's paradoxical given its high per capita wealth and centrality to the global economy. But Taiwan has not become a highly international society, partly because it was ostracized. The consolidation of a local Taiwanese identity distinct from that of China has emphasized local culture, which sometimes are at odds with internationalization. Taiwan runs the risk of becoming connected with the outside world increasingly through China. And Taiwan's isolation from organizations that require statehood for membership also makes it difficult. Taiwan needs creative ways to engage with the world outside the sinosphere, such as through civil society and the non-governmental sectors. Last but not least, and I'll end my remarks with this, the fifth P is the pandemic, which has spotlighted how successful Taiwan can be and yet how difficult it is for Taiwan to get out of its trap. The challenges are interconnected, and we need to reconceptualize a more resilient and innovative society to better handle the complexities of the future. Taiwan was a success story in 2020 because it recorded fewer than 10 COVID-19 deaths. And in a healthy environment, Taiwan's semiconductor industry grew to meet demand for computers and electronic devices as the world transitioned to working and learning from home. However, managing the outbreak has proven to be more difficult in 2021 and 2022, with the new variants emerging. Taiwan now struggles between opening up its borders and protecting public health as the death rate increases. The longer Taiwan struggles with formulating a COVID policy that protects both people's health and their economic livelihoods, the more likely it is to be left behind as the world reopens. This is why we need long-term research on building resilience into our political and economic systems. We need evidence-based assessments shared in a timely manner to respond to quick-moving, unforeseen crises like a pandemic. While strategic competition in the Taiwan Strait is a crucial existential issue for Taiwan's future, the 5 Ps are ongoing challenges that would be important even if China did not threaten Taiwan. Democracies must collaborate to identify and share best practices that can build resilience across political systems, and Taiwan must be a part of it, starting with public health. Through this collaboration, Taiwan can offer both its experience and learn from others on these common challenges. My hope is that Taiwan will be known and important to the world, not because it is a hotspot, and not only because it makes the most advanced chips at the lowest possible cost, but that it is a center of good ideas in how to deliver benefits to a wide spectrum of society. Taiwan is important to the world because it is an example of good democratic governance, more sustainable business, and improved quality of life that transcend the geopolitical challenges of our day. Thank you very much, and sorry for the technical mishap.
Thank you, Shelley. You raised an interesting point there that I hope we can touch on, is about the political polarization, and we can ask yourself later and others as to what extent then is China's interference in the Taiwanese elections resemble the interference that we've talked about in Britain and in the US from other nations and vested interest parties. But that's fascinating that you actually paint us a picture of this society that has got internal threats, and it's not just the threat of a Chinese missile landing on Taipei 101. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. James Lee, who's a postdoctoral research associate of the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California. He did his PhD at Princeton, and his work has been published in the Journal of Strategic Studies, the Journal of East Asian Studies, the Journal of Chinese Political Science, as well as many others. And he is also in Taiwan, where he's about to join the Institute of European and American Studies in Taiwan itself. So we have 2 speakers here from Taiwan. I was going to ask him if he's taken his flak jacket because he's worried about what might happen. But James is going to fill us in on the legal status of Taiwan and how that slots into the current world order. So James Lee, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. And thank you to Lord Bruce and the Democracy Forum for inviting me to speak on this panel. It's a great honor to be on a panel with so many distinguished friends and colleagues who work on Taiwan. So first, I'll answer the question of the panel. Is Taiwan key to the continuing world order? The answer, I think, is yes. Because the threat that Taiwan faces raises the question of whether or not the international order is able to resist attempts to annex territory by an authoritarian great power. And if China were successful in annexing Taiwan, it would threaten a fundamental pillar of the post-World War II international order. And China likes to claim that Taiwan is under its sovereignty. And that kind of rhetoric from Beijing is trying to encourage us to fall into what a philosopher or logician might call the fallacy of the false alternatives, where because we meaning many countries that have a one China policy don't recognize Taiwan as an independent state. China wants us to think that that means we have to recognize Taiwan as part of China. And there's a third path, and it's the path the position that the United States has taken, that the European Union, that the United Kingdom, Australia, and Japan have all taken, which is a one China policy, and that does not include recognition of Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, and also not recognizing Taiwan as independent. And so that kind of intermediate legal status and how we got here in the history of the US, China, Taiwan relationship is what I'll focus on in my presentation. So the history of this dispute starts in 1895 when Taiwan was ceded to Japan after the First Sino-Japanese War. And the last time there was an international consensus about Taiwan was in the Cairo Declaration. And China often uses the Cairo Declaration as a way of asserting its claim over Taiwan, but there's actually an important detail in the Cairo Declaration that doesn't often get discussed. The Cairo Declaration said that Taiwan and Penghu, quote, shall be restored to the Republic of China. And Beijing's claim to Taiwan is based on two arguments that are both highly contested. One of their arguments is that Taiwan was restored to Chinese sovereignty after World War II. And the second argument that they make is that the Republic of China has ceased to exist and that Beijing has inherited title and claim to the former territory of the Republic of China. Both of these claims are highly contested because the United States and many other countries do not recognize that there was a transfer of sovereignty to China after World War II. And Taiwan has called itself the Republic of China and maintains that the Republic of China still exists and has existed ever since 1912. So China's claim to Taiwan is based on two highly debatable legal arguments of what happened after World War II. And the position that the United States has taken, and I'm speaking more about the US position because that's what I specialize in. The position of the United States is that Taiwan's legal status is undetermined. President Truman said on June 27, 1950, that the future determination of the status of Formosa must await the restoration of security in the Pacific, a peace settlement with Japan, or consideration by the United Nations. And according to the United States, in the San Francisco Peace Treaty and the Treaty of Taipei, Japan surrendered sovereignty over Taiwan, but Japan never transferred sovereignty to China. So the United States has always maintained since June 27, 1950, that the status of Taiwan is undetermined, and that, according to the United States, gives the United States the legal right to intervene in the defense of Taiwan because Taiwan is not part of China, according to the United States. The other side of that is that Taiwan is not an independent country, but Taiwan is also not part of China. U.S. officials don't often assert this part of the one China policy because it often leads to tensions with Beijing, and Beijing reacts badly whenever the U.S. clarifies this aspect of the one China policy. But it is an important part of the one China policy, and it's been confirmed by many communiques and documents. And so one that I will touch on in the interest of time is the Shanghai Communique and what the United States said in the Shanghai Communique, how there's actually considerable misunderstanding about what the United States intended. So the key part of the Shanghai Communique that is probably best known for the long-term development of the one China policy is that the Shanghai Communique says the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. So there are two details to that that are often missed, and there's a part of the U.S. position that is only kind of implied. The first part is that when the U.S. referred to the acknowledging this position, it does not mean recognizing. The United States takes notice of this position, but does not agree with the position that there is one China and Taiwan is part of China. Another piece of this is that when the United States said it acknowledged that the Chinese in Taiwan believe this, the China that the Chinese in Taiwan believed Taiwan was part of was the Republic of China and not the People's Republic of China. And the third part of this, which is very rarely appreciated in the study of that particular statement in the Shanghai Communique, all Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China, is that the United States chose that phrasing because it knew at the time that many Taiwanese did not share that position. And so the United States did not want the Shanghai Communique to be phrased in such a way that claimed to speak for all the people of Taiwan. Only the Chinese, meaning Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, were believed to adhere to that position confidently. the Taiwanese, whose voices were silenced during the authoritarian era and were not allowed to express their own national identity, did not necessarily hold that view. And so when we fast forward in the 50 years since then, Taiwanese are able to express their national identity and to assert their position on Taiwan's political status. And now there is a debate in Taiwan, and this is part of the polarization that Shirley alluded to, that there is a polarization about whether or not Taiwan is part of China. But even though there is this intense polarization in Taiwan, there is a consensus, at least among the KMT and the DPP, about two things. First, the Republic of China still exists instead of Beijing's attempts to deny its existence. Sometimes they call it the Republic of China, sometimes they call it the Republic of China Taiwan, but the Republic of China still exists. And the second part of this consensus in Taiwan is that Taiwan has never been part of the People's Republic of China. And so when we look at the polarization, which I agree is very concerning in many ways, there is still a consensus in Taiwan surrounding these kind of very critical aspects of its relationship with Beijing. I'm happy to answer any further questions there may be about the very kind of complex legal issues, but those are the broad outlines of the history, and I look forward to the question and answer later.
Right, thank you very much for that, James. Again, can I just clarify that one? You touched on it, what the KMT, which is now in opposition, and the DPP, which is the ruling party, what their position is on what Taiwan is. Could you go into that a little more?
Sure. So for the KMT, they adhere to the abstract principle that Taiwan and the mainland are both part of one China. But the China that they refer to is the Republic of China and not the People's Republic of China. For the DPP, they agree that the name of the country is the Republic of China Taiwan, parentheses, Taiwan, but they do not agree with the KMT that Taiwan and the mainland are both part of one China. So and this is part of the reason for the recent tensions is they're not willing to subscribe to the view that mainland China and Taiwan are both part of the same country.
Okay, so the KMT view is reflecting what we're hearing now a lot from Western capitals and have been over the past year or so, separating off the Chinese people as it is from the Communist Party of China. And I heard in one person I spoke to in the Baltic states here that the Chinese Communist Party was in fact occupying China and it had to be ousted from there. Would you go along with that view that that's what is consolidating here?
Historically, that was the view of the KMT, especially during the Cold War era, that the KMT refused to recognize the People's Republic of China as legitimate state, and the KMT maintained that it and the Republic of China was a sole legal government of China, and the KMT in the Cold War era I saw itself as the defender of Chinese civilization and Chinese humanism against the forces of totalitarianism and communism. And today, the KMT views that one China concept in much more of an abstract way.
Okay.
And more traditionalists among the KMT would say that they would not be opposed to unification in the future if mainland China became a democracy. But right now, the KMT isn't quite as ideological as it was during the Cold War era.
And nor is the DPP, is it? Because it is no longer wanting to declare independence.
No, the DPP's position, which in interesting ways is similar to the KMT, is that the Republic of China is already independent and sovereign and has been since 1912. And so Taiwan said in her interview with the BBC that they already are independent, and so they don't need to declare independence. So these are both, so this is a centrist view, and the main difference with the KMT is whether or not this Republic of China also includes the mainland.
Okay, and a quick tangential question that's come in from one of the audience, Ajay Pratap Singh Rathore, says, would Taiwan's dominance of the semiconductor industry really provide it with a silicon shield, as in apostrophes?
I think so. I wouldn't say that this idea of the silicon shield guarantees U.S. intervention or the intervention of the international community, but it significantly raises the likelihood of U.S. and allied intervention in the defense of Taiwan. Because if we wind the clock back to the Cold War, when these first assessments of Taiwan's strategic importance were being developed in the U.S. government, Taiwan at that time was considered important, but not vital to U.S. interests because Taiwan didn't have the industrial potential of West Germany and Japan. And so at that time, part of the reason why Taiwan was left out of Atchison's defensive perimeter speech was because its consideration of Taiwan's industrial potential. It was still mostly agricultural at that time. But now if we look at the situation today and how critical Taiwan's chip industry is, Taiwan arguably is on the same order of importance as Germany and Japan. And it is true that in a conflict, Taiwan's industry would be damaged, and that a military conflict would have a severe impact on Taiwan's strategic value for the United States and its allies. But it's not so much about the intact physical infrastructure, but about the human resource potential and the industrial potential of Taiwan.
Oh, and thank you so much. Stay with us because I'm sure we're going to get deeper into these issues. And of course, the semiconductor industry, all of Taiwan's industry, has become part of what it is because of its massive trade with China. So we have war on the one hand, but the trade between those two entities, for want of a better word, is huge, which is why we're now going to Dr. Chun-Yi Lee, Associate Professor and Director of the Taiwan Studies Program, who is not in Taipei, but in Nottingham. And fewer know more about trade and business relationship, though, between Taiwan and China than Dr. Lee. Among her many strands of research, Dr. Lee has looked into the interaction between Taiwanese businessmen and Chinese local officials. That's the cross-straits trade I'm talking about, from 1987 to 2010. And those were the years that straddled Taiwan's transition to become the first democracy in a Chinese society. Fascinating stuff. And there is a lot more. We are lucky to have Dr. Chun-Yi Lee with us to share her expertise. So Dr. Lee, the screen is yours.
Thank you. And good local time to everyone, because this is an international panel, and especially thanks for the backstage team of the Democracy Forum to invite us all to join this meaningful debate. So as the introducer to say that my research is about the trade, and what I wanted to present or discuss with us all today is not only about the cross trades of Taiwanese investment in China and Chinese very few investment in Taiwan, but more so is to the opening speech by Lord Bruce about the semiconductor, and it's everything in our mind of why Taiwan would be important even more so in continuing the world order. So what I would like to talk about today is about the digitalization of Taiwan, both in the hardware of the semiconductor companies in Taiwan. And in a few minutes, I will talk about the software of the digital democracy in Taiwan. But first part, let me just recap of all our distinguished speakers, including the opening speech by Lord Bruce about the semiconductor companies in Taiwan. We all know, as James just talked about, the strengths of Taiwanese manufacturer in the global semiconductor chip making markets. Let me give you some percentage that the TSMC, the Taiwan semiconductor companies, actually produce 53% of the global chips markets. The second producer is Samsung in Korea. Is 16%, and the rest would be divided by other companies in the chip making production trend. And that actually accentuates why Taiwan is so important in terms of the semiconductor production. And as we all know, probably I just briefly mentioned that why that is important, because every electronic products, including cars, including computers, mobile, even microwave, needs a chip to function. So that pretty much answered why Taiwan's manufacturing production is so important to continue the electronic world order, if you like. That actually would come back to why Taiwan would be so continuously would be so crucial in the production? In my view, actually, let's start it from the developmental state situation that was in the 1980s or late 1970s, that Taiwan was still during the authoritarian period with the planned economy, followed the so-called developmental state approach. That is, the government invested on the certain sector in Taiwan, that's technology sector, established Hsinchu Science Park, and also the connection between Taiwanese human talents, as also our previous speakers mentioned about the high human talented capital in Taiwan. Let's start it not just now, way before, like in the 80s, of the Taiwanese graduates in in Silicon Valley and return to Taiwan. So that strong connection actually funded by the government funds and also the researchers between Taiwan and USA, and also what I learned from my own research in the Taiwanese manufacturer in China, that is the manufacturer spirits that Taiwanese companies have, the continuity and the stable production, that is very key for any high technology production in the manufacturer industry. So that's why one of the main reason I would argue that Taiwanese company TSMC is a key production of the semiconductor in the world. Of course, that result into the potential of the highly likelihood that now we are talking about the semiconductor shield on Taiwan, if you like, silicon shield on Taiwan. But don't forget, China is still, I'm not saying lurking, but still in the production chain in many ways. So China, Taiwan's connection still very strong in terms of the manufacturing. So Taiwan is a high-end manufacturer, but China is the low-end production of the assembling and also, the large scale of the low-skilled workers situated in China. So it is actually, I would argue, that difficult to decouple from China because of the human capital, low skill capital in China. They're still there. But what Taiwan have and Taiwan is very precious about is a high skilled research capital in Taiwan in terms of the semiconductor manufacture markets. And with that in mind, I would like to go to my another part of the software of Taiwanese digital democracy. So if you can go to the second slide. What I think actually Taiwan is important to continue the world order, if one may say, is not only because of the need that the world need Taiwan to produce the chips, as we just mentioned about Taiwan manufacturing more than 50% of the semiconductor market in the world, but more so is the quality of Taiwan in terms of the openness of the democracy and also the digital democracy emerging in Taiwan. So some of us might heard of this project of Government Zero, that is started by, actually, if some of our audience, and I'm sure all of our speakers know about the sunflower movement, started in 2014. And from that sunflower movement, actually, there started a group of civic engineers, so-called hikers. They are wanting that the government to have more of avant-garde change, more open resources, more of the digital connection, if possible, for citizens to get all the information. So they started this movement of Government Zero, and they started to argue that the government information should be more open for the citizens' usage, and not only so, the government's policy should translate. I use this word translate, not because the government's information is written in English in Taiwan. No, the government information usually is written as a more of a difficult understanding knowledge, and also not really easy for the citizens to understand. So those hikers are demanding that the government's information should be more easy to be understood by any normal citizens, and they are creating this movement, if you like, continuous movement of government zero. That is a group of hikers, they get together, or civic engineers, they get together and design more user-friendly software to the citizens, and also bring the bridge between government and the civil society. The nominal figure is the digital minister, that is Audrey Tong. That she started a very legendary person. She started from the sunflower movement by land, and then she entered to the cabinet into us. We call her as a digital minister, but actually she is a minister with no profile, in a sense that she's more engaged with the civil society in connection with the government. So what I found actually, or I would like to share with us all actually more, is in a sense of the characteristics of the civil society in Taiwan, and more so that this civil society is active, dynamics, and responsive to create more of the digital platform, if you like, or platform to connect government and the society. And in that sense, actually this civil society, or this group of hikers during COVID time, they create a lot of the user friendly apps for the citizens. For instance, that the citizen will be able to know which pharmacist at early time, right? Which pharmacist will be able to sell masks, and they can go there to buy masks. Or how can we track individual citizens' digital footprints without really invade citizens' privacy. So it is important to distinguish this digital democracy developed in Taiwan against or in difference from the digital surveillance in China. And I think personally that is the key in many ways, that Taiwan is important to contribute to continuous the world order. Because in fact, after COVID, as many of us, two of our speakers already say, that people are more relying on the online activities. Not only that Taiwan produced the hardware support for the online activities. That's what I mentioned earlier, the chip making. But actually, the digital moral society, if you like, is created in or through this group of very active, buoyant civil engineers, so-called hackers in Taiwan. I do find that this is a very interesting phenomenon from Taiwan, and I think this can be one of the good reason that Taiwan can contribute to the continuous world order. And I should stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chun-Yi Lee. Can I just, before I let you go, nail down a couple of things? 53% of semiconductors from Taiwan, 16% from South Korea, that's 69% and these are two sort of pro-Western American allies. Is China in joint production with Taiwan on this, or does it produce its own, or how does that work?
So semiconductor works as a supply chain. Taiwan and South Korea, like Samsung, produced high end of the semiconductors chips making. And China is doing the assembling, the low end. So China itself also export the chips making, but they sort of is at the low end.
So they're working
the
with
assembling.
Taiwanese on that. These are joint venture companies, are they, that build them? The Chinese and the Taiwanese build them together?
Well, the thing with the joint company, that is the companies located in China to produce, they probably still Taiwanese owned. And this is actually the key for most Western like-minded democracies to be noted because they don't really want it to produce by the Chinese-owned company for the reason of the possibility to be still the knowledge. And don't forget, China is aiming at China Made 2025, the indigenous chip making. Who knows whether that would come true, but that's their aim.
Yeah, just a couple of quick questions for you. So when we talk about a new world order, or Russia or China trying to create their own world order, they can't do that, can they? Because they can't make semiconductors.
They can't now.
Right. So
they can't now. They can't now. They can't now. I can say they cannot do now.
They cannot. Yes.
They cannot. Of course, I wish they would never be able to write, but this is be an academic, have to be objective. So there are two schools of thinking. One is, why don't we keep China dependent in the value chain? That means we keep China here. They always will depend on the chip design from the USA, high-end manufacturer from Taiwan, South Korea, and they do the low-end job. But the other school of thinking is China is very good in learning, and you just never know when they can produce. But what I found is, it's not because the West wanted to decouple from China. China already wanted to decouple from the West in terms of technology since 2015, when Xi Jinping launched this China Made 2025. They don't want to rely on Western technology. So, it's not because the West, after Trump say, oh, we don't want to work with China, we want to decouple. China wanted to decouple more than the West.
But it's not there at the moment. So as Lord Charles, quoting Charles Parton at the end, it says it's not going to, the invasion of Taiwan is not going to happen in the foreseeable future. It couldn't happen in the foreseeable future because communications all over the world would just collapse.
I do hope that in a sense, well, of course, speaking also personally and very selfishly, that it would never happen that any of the military invention on Taiwan, for the reason actually China also relying on Taiwan to produce the semiconductor.
Exactly. Yes. Well, thank you very much for that and for helping me nail it down. We are now going to Simona Grano, the director of the Taiwan Studies Project at the University of Zurich. And one of her latest publications, the title of which I love, Cat Warriors versus Wolf Warriors, How Taiwan Promotes Its Brand in the Face of a More Assertive China. The Wolf Warriors is China and the Cat Warriors are the more cunning Taiwanese. Simona Grano will delve into the changing perceptions about Taiwan from Europe, from the prism of the COVID pandemic, China's push to marginalize it and put that in a balance with Russia's invasions of Ukraine. That's a real global mix. So Simona Grano, share your thoughts.
Right. First of all, can you hear me and see me well?
Absolutely can. Yes, you're looking good.
Right. So thank you for the invitation, for mentioning the article. Chun-Yi will be happy because it was published on our blog, Taiwan Insight. And yes, I will be talking to you about how perception, I should say, or attitude towards Taiwan have shifted in Europe. And I thought about focusing on two countries I know best, which are Italy, where I grew up, and Switzerland, where I am now currently residing since 13 years, right? So I'm going to keep the part on geopolitics short because we have far greater experts like Shelley and Shirley who have already talked about it and will talk about that. But anyway, you can imagine that what I will focus on is the fact that all over Europe, and of course in this Switzerland and Italy are no exception, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has, of course, led to threat perception rising in Asia and in Europe, relevance of Taiwan is actually growing considerably. And as I said, there's an increasing number of European actors which have started to embrace the idea of sort of like broadening their engagement with Taiwan and also expand on existing economic ties, right? But I think what is interesting to note here is that there is another aspect which goes beyond economic ties, which is that you hear increasingly more mentioned also in the media that Taiwan is a like-minded partner that shares the values of the West. It has a system of governance based on democracy, rule of law, respect for human rights, and of course, an open society and a market economy. So I started to ask myself, because Taiwan has actually possessed this positive story as a strong, stable democracy that deserves to be shared with the world for a few years. So what has prompted a different positioning towards Taiwan in the past 2 years in Europe, and why, right? And of course, the answer I gave myself is that it is often shifts in geopolitical domains that amplify Taiwan's capacity for being heard. And I will mention at least 3 factors here. So first of all, what you mentioned in your introduction, the corona pandemic, when distrust and disquiet vis-a-vis China was intensifying across the globe, and of course in Europe, and more countries came to see Taiwan as a more trustworthy and reliable partner. For instance, since what Chun-Yi has just addressed, resilient supply chains, semiconductor, data protection, and overall a more like-minded partner in terms of economic and political cooperation, right? The second point is that this initial shift in perceptions regarding Taiwan has actually led to a secondary reaction to Taiwan's increasing diplomatic and economic marginalization, right, by China in the international realm, which has been, of course, brought about by the PRC, and which now, after the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is leading to a pushback from Taipei and also from other countries, right? And the third point is actually the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has sort of like reinvigorated an attempt to link democratic governments together in a more exclusive, if you want, network, in order to sort of like either create, I would say, a new order, or maybe we can argue later, maintain the current order, right? But anyway, trying to force countries to make a series of value judgments and imposing penalties for illiberal behaviors, right? So, as I said, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europe's geopolitical situation has been in flux. So let me now briefly address how perception of Taiwan has changed in Italy, and then briefly in Switzerland. So concerning particularly Italy, there is one person, Paolo Formentini, is a deputy chairperson of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Italian Chamber of Deputies, which has been quite active in establishing or trying to establish more institutionalized ties to Taiwan in the past 2 years. In fact, a resolution proposed by him about the new geopolitical situation after Russia invaded Ukraine passed with an unanimous vote in April, and really calls for the Italian government to attach more importance to the Indo-Pacific region, because, of course, we want to maintain regional peace and stability in the face, that's what the resolution says, of authoritarian expansion. The resolution is interesting because it actually sort of like requires the Italian government to set up a more encompassing vision for Italy in the region, and not only diplomatic. It talks about, for example, staffing diplomatic posts, especially political offices in the region, allocating more resources for forums in the region, and promoting a bigger reflection on the challenges that the PRC poses to Taiwan and also to Western values. But the proposal goes further and also pleads for an increased, not only diplomatic, but also military presence of Italy in the region. And in fact, it really mentions the several joint military exercises which have been carried out in the Indo-Pacific, especially the recent Balikatan, I think it was called, between the US and the Philippines. And the proponent of the resolution really say Italy should also start to take part to these exercises, arguing that France is already an Indo-Pacific power, Germany has a vision for the region. What is needed now is for Italy also to have a better encompassing vision for the region, right? And I want to just make the point that the fact that this was tied to the Russian invasion of Ukraine is really clear, because the resolution really says this is a direct consequence of the mutated geopolitical environment in Europe and in Asia after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it talks about the fact that the Indo-Pacific region is actually quite close to us, even though not geographically, but it talks about supply chain, Taiwan leading the field, semiconductors, the importance of it. And concerning Taiwan directly, and let me quote, it says, it's a democracy that has taught the world how to manage the pandemic without restricting the liberties of its citizens, that is vital for the world concerning microchip productions, and is now being threatened by China. So we need to do something. And very briefly on Switzerland and Taiwan, Switzerland is a rather cautious nation regarding doing anything that might upset its relationship with China. But even here, there is a growing realization among the public and the government of Taiwan's importance for the rest of the world, right? So there was long an idea to establish between Switzerland and Taiwan a free trade agreement, which in the end did not come through because the Swiss authorities believed that the financial advantages and savings would have been insignificant. The unsaid thing was, it was not worth irritating China or creating a diplomatic problem for such modest amounts of custom duty savings. Recently, however, and this is also, in my opinion, directly linked to the mutated geopolitical situation with Ukraine, in mid-June, so 1 month ago, there was a motion deposited for a Swiss-Taiwan Technology Science Cooperation, which has been proposed, which sort of aims at consolidating and deepening cooperation with Taiwan in the fields of science, technology, innovation, and culture. This has been presented, the motion, by the Social Democratic Party. It has not yet been discussed, but it's interesting because here again, I want to quote what the resolution says, or the motion, and it really says, the Russian invasion or war of aggression against Ukraine has reminded us of the value of good relations with countries and regions that share our values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And with a view to peace and stability in the world, deepening cultural, educational, research, and innovation cooperation with Taiwan can play a significant role. The current cooperation is highly expandable and currently underdeveloped, the party says, compared to the existing relations with Chinese institutions in the mainland, right? So I don't have time because I already, I'm nearing my end. I still have 2 minutes to go into how Europe-Taiwan relationship has been changed, but you can imagine that nothing happens in a vacuum, and what is going on in Italy and Switzerland is really, of course, taking cue of what is going on at a broader European level. But let me come to my short conclusions. Of course, after the aggression and the rekindled discussion, the aggression, of course, of Russia on Ukraine, and the rekindled discussion of the global stage sort of possibly dividing itself into two blocks, and of course, the highly ideologically charged debate of democracies versus autocracies, we really see how Taiwan has assumed an even higher, not only ideological value, but also ideological value, I would say. So the island, of course, in this case, is the best example that a society that belongs to the Chinese cultural sphere is actually compatible with democratic values, openness, and transparency, and really does stand in direct contradiction to China's rhetoric, emphasizing an incompatibility of Western values with Chinese culture characteristics. So I think in Europe, what we see really is the question of with which policy and which economic method can it be possible to make solidarity with Taiwan's democracy a cornerstone of European China policy without failing, as we have done so far, due to the obstacles arising from very tight economic dependencies from China, right? So renewed discussions about rekindling and deepening ties to Taiwan are actually not about Europe or the United States prescribing to Taiwan and China how relations across the strait should develop. But I really would say the point is to prevent, as far as possible, any reckless alteration of these relations by unilateral Chinese action. In the worst case, as we have talked about, in the case of a military nature, which of course would result in an escalation of dangerous, globally destabilizing risks. And I think it is really important to communicate to China that the Western world will actually not stand by and watch idly China alter the status quo, because this would also have tremendous impacts for Taiwan, first and foremost, but also for the rest of the world and for its security architecture. And I'm going to stop here, and I think we can talk more in depth later.
Simona, thank you so much. And because you're such a good timekeeper, can I take you up on something that you said you didn't have time for? Because the European Union, we have Hungary's Viktor Orban on one side of it. In Lithuania has upgraded the status of Taiwan in a tiny way. The Czech Republic, the mayor of Prague, has changed his affiliation with Prague with Taiwan. There is a mix of stuff going on there, but when I was in Lithuania recently, they said they wouldn't do anything dramatic without the EU consensus on it. So where do you see that consensus going? You did touch on it, but where are we going to be a year or 2 years from now with that?
Well, I think it's difficult to say, but you're absolutely right. There is a mixed reaction. It is true, though, as I said, Switzerland and Italy are not happening. These changes or the shift in perceptions are not happening in a vacuum. They are observing what is going on at the European level, right? So it's true that now things have been quieted down a bit, but it is also true that with China as well, the comprehensive agreement on investments eventually did not go through. And on cue of that, and seeing also how difficult the situation is evolving with China, not just because of its authoritarian nature, but also because of the supply chains disruption, because of the COVID lockdowns. So I do see that there is an increased discussion at the European level about how to rekindle ties with Taiwan, always bearing in mind, just like in the case of Switzerland and Italy, how to do that without irritating China too much or going one step forward, right? Or how can I say, going too much further in this breaking of relationship, because of course what happened in the case of Lithuania for China was absolutely an unwelcome move, right? Allowing them to actually call the office with the name of Taiwan in it. So what we have seen, I think, is that we are seeing the European Parliament launching a diplomatic and economic offensive in a way, trying to adopt a more comprehensive plan to boost Taiwan's economic resilience, but also its international recognition. So you have seen a lot of official visits, which have increased on both parliamentary as well as trade delegation levels between the EU and single member states and Taiwan, despite pressures from Beijing, a bit similar to what you have seen in the case of the US, right? And we are discussing with the Nancy Pelosi case as well.
Yes.
And among the European institutions, and I'm coming to the conclusion, the European Parliament has actually articulated the most support for expanding links with Taipei. It has a standalone report on EU-Taiwan relations, and members of the European Parliament recommended multiple engagement measures, including, for example, exploring the option of a EU-Taiwan bilateral investment agreement. But it is also true that last year, when they went to Taiwan, I think it was members of the, if I remember correctly, of the European Parliament Special Committee on Foreign Interference, which went to Taiwan and discussed joint strategies to counter disinformation, but they did so representing themselves as in individual capacities, not the EU Parliament. So there is still this back and forth, you know, between being overly cautious because of China, but helping Taiwan.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And of course, the European Union Parliament is much more stronger and influential than it was, say, a decade ago. It's beginning now to take a lead that the Commission has to follow rather than the other way around. Thank you so much for that. Raymond Kuo, our next panelist, is a political scientist at America's Rand Corporation and an expert in international security. And he published 2 books last year, my goodness. Following the Leader, that was about military alliances in the Indo-Pacific, and Contests of Initiative, that's on China's maritime gray zone strategy. And of course, we must remember that the Indo-Pacific, which is mentioned a lot, is basically a maritime contest. Whereas in Europe, when you think that's a land contest, but this is a maritime contest. Raymond Kuo is going to be asking whether a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would inspire the same reaction from the global community as Russia's war in Ukraine. So Raymond Kuo, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Humphrey. It's an honor to be here, especially with such an amazing panel, like experts who are far more knowledgeable than me. So if any of the audience wants to go get a cup of coffee, I totally understand. So the question at the table is Taiwan key to the continuing world order? And my answer is going to be somewhat redundant to James's. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what are the critical dimensions of the current liberal international order? I'd say the most critical ones for this question are twofold. 1, territorial sovereignty. 2, a constitutional order. The common institutions and rules bind and limit the returns to power. And with Ukraine, we're seeing that states will react very strongly to violations of territorial sovereignty and constitutional order. So we can ask ourselves, in the case of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, would we see the same or an even bigger response? So let's take those 2 points in turn. Territorial sovereignty. So Taiwan has only limited international sovereignty. Relatively few countries recognize Taiwan officially, and many of those countries follow the One China principle, not the policy, but the principle that not only acknowledges China's position, but accepts it, that Taiwan is part of China. And so are other countries willing to support Taiwan, rhetorically, publicly, to defend their own sovereignty and sovereignty claims? Beijing hopes the answer is no, but I think the Ukraine war suggests the answer is not so clear-cut. At least with Ukraine, you see countries like Kenya, which doesn't really have an interest in Ukrainian sovereignty, or doesn't have really economic or political interest in Ukraine, getting in front of the UN General Assembly and defending it based on a clear recognition that defense of territorial sovereignty matters, especially for smaller countries. And as Dr. Grano just pointed out, there's been a kind of a wave of small state engagement, increase in diplomatic ties with Taiwan, especially in Europe. You see Lithuania stepping up its economic relationships with Taiwan. The Czech Republic sent a delegation last year. Also, the European Parliamentary Committee, as she had mentioned, Nancy Pelosi's coming as well, I guess, in a month or so. And there's a recognition here that a Chinese war of conquest against Taiwan would still be a violation of sovereignty norms, even though relatively few countries internationally recognize Taiwan. There's still a violation of sovereignty because there are other types of sovereignties that matter as well. Westphalian sovereignty, having authority within your own borders that isn't being mucked around in by other countries. Interdependence, being able to regulate the flow of goods and information and capital crossing your borders. Those things really matter for small states as well, and a Chinese conquest would activate these concerns for a whole variety of countries. Now, the discussion so far has been on legal or ideational sources of legitimacy and sovereignty. And to some extent, we're focused on the discussion of sovereignty is focused on countries that are kind of far away from Taiwan. So how does this translate into political action, especially within Asia? And here I think we need to talk about the constitutional roots of the international order. According to John Eikenberry, a professor at Princeton, who's, full disclosure, used to be my mentor, I think for Dr. James Lee as well, maybe. And the idea here is that, yes, territorial sovereignty is an important norm within the international order, but it's protected not through military conquest, but through binding rules, common standards and policy expectations, international institutions that constrain and channel conflict and manage it and resolve it. And China, over the last, say, 10, 15 years, especially under Xi Jinping, has really messed up here. It's shown that it's not going to follow a lot of the institutional and international rules that exist. With Australia and South Korea, it's retaliated with economic retaliation against political stances, diplomatic stances made by those two countries. That's not allowable under the WTO rules. With the Philippines, it's willfully sort of disregarding the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the Arbitral Tribunal. So these are rules about where does maritime territory, where does it stop and where does it begin? The Chinese are saying we don't abide by those rules. With India, it's engaged in territorial and military coercion. And also with something that Joseph Nye calls sharp power. It's leveraging its domestic market to coerce international businesses. I think perhaps the most iconic recent example is, many of you have seen Top Gun Maverick. Maverick was wearing a jacket that had a flag, a Taiwanese flag and a Japanese flag. And in an initial sort of screenshots, they'd actually kind of wiped it out because they were trying to get into the Chinese market. And so Beijing is increasingly acting in ways that do not abide by international constraints. And that's understandably scaring everyone in the region nearby. And this is only going to get worse as Xi consolidates his power domestically and becomes more and more of what in comparative politics we call a personalistic dictatorship. So Taiwan matters to the Asian regional order, not just because of its semiconductor industry and its status as a democracy, but also because other countries are viewing it as a litmus test for both how the United States as well as China will they or will they not adhere to the current liberal international order, which in many cases serves their interests. Taiwan's position has clear policy implications, security implications for other Asian countries. And so, kind of wrapping up here, insofar as Taiwan is critical for the world order, it's because of two factors. One, it activates those territorial sovereignty concerns for other countries. And two, it's a litmus test for other Asian countries for the world order's durability. And with that, I'll return the time back to Humphrey.
Two follow-up questions for you, one from the audience, one from myself. And this first one, I think it might seem to be quite obvious, but with your international security hat on, the West, Americans, British, the French, Australians, I think, have been carrying out freedom of navigation operations through the Taiwan Straits and in the South China Sea in order to secure trade routes and supply chains and freedom of passage. Why then are the similar operations not being carried out in the waters around Ukraine in order to prevent a global food crisis?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So I think in part it's because China still gains to some extent from the international order. It's probably the biggest beneficiary of the economic aspects of the order: free trade, open exchange of information and capital. And also, China is a far more trade-exposed country than, say, Russia. Surprisingly so. To its credit, for an economy of that size, it is shockingly open to international exchange. That also means, however, that it doesn't want to challenge or contest freedom of navigation because it depends on that to drive a lot of its domestic economy. Russia, by contrast, doesn't really need that. Its economy is heavily concentrated in natural resources. Most of those aren't shipped by sea, but rather by pipeline. And so it can afford to be much more belligerent in the Black Sea.
So just to sort of sum it up, those display of force by the aircraft carriers and the cruisers and the rest of it is only a display of force as long as they are not going to get shot at. If they're going to get shot at, they wouldn't do it.
By the Chinese, you mean?
About the concept of protecting supply routes in the world order.
Oh, they would be much more cautious. I think, of course, when you're talking about missiles flying, you're always going to be much more cautious. But right now, I think the question is not, if we're thinking about Russia and Ukraine versus the Western countries, Ukraine is not as valuable for those other, say, Western countries in terms of what things it will ship by what resources it will ship via sea. And B, Russia has demonstrated that it is much more willing to fight over Ukraine. With China, I think that's a bit different. The Chinese don't necessarily think they have maritime dominance yet. And while they may be able to project power into the first island chain, that dominance doesn't extend much further than that. And so they would still, because they're so focused on international trade, not just regional trade, they would face high costs for trying to shoot at a FONOPS, for example.
And can I pass to you a question from David Davis, which we'll put up on the screen let's get it up on the screen. There we are. Following the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, are autocratic governments across the world now questioning the West's resolve to defend its neighbors, particularly when it comes to upholding democratic values?
It's a great question. I tend not to think so. One thing that one sort of theory that people often has is, do we see sort of domino effects? If the US isn't going to defend in Vietnam, is Thailand next? And I tend not to believe that. Or I think they do happen, but they happen in world wars. So we're going to leave that aside, and hopefully that doesn't happen. The idea that Afghanistan demonstrates a lack of US resolve, well, I question that, because if you're an Asian country, this is kind of great for you. It suggests that the US is not going to be tied down in a 20-year engagement in Afghanistan. Instead, they can actually devote their resources and their strategic planning towards your defense, not Afghanistan. There's a trade-off here across these different issues. And I think, if we want to ask, what is the biggest sort of hit to Western resolve to defend neighbors and democratic values, I actually think it's the kind of internal rot we see in Western democracies right now. That insofar as we think that countries defend each other because of their values, the fact that many countries in the traditional West, whatever we want to define that, are going more authoritarian or autocratic is a bad sign for defense of other democracies.
Thank you so much for helping me understand that all. And we come now to our final panelist, who's actually put over a great point in the private chat, which I hope that she brings up during her presentation. Dr. Shelley Rigger, Professor of Political Science, specializing in East Asian politics at America's Davidson College. She has been visiting professors at universities in Taiwan and China. And her two most recent books, Why Taiwan Matters, Small Island, Global Powerhouse, and last year's The Tiger Leading the Dragon, how Taiwan propelled China's economic rise. Will it also propel its democratic rise, I might ask her afterwards. Dr. Shelley Rigger is going to help us with that one and put in perspective Taiwan's relationship with Beijing and Washington. Dr. Rigger, the screen is yours.
All right, thank you so much, and congratulations on assembling such an international panel. It's, at least in the U.S., it's pretty unusual to have people from so many different countries participating in an event like this, and I know it's a lot of work to get everybody in the same time space, even if not in the same time zone. So well done. I think what I'd like to do is to connect to the theme, is Taiwan key to the continuing global world order, from a slightly different direction. So my colleagues have done a great job of explaining why Taiwan matters in many different realms, economically, politically, in terms of our ability to defend democracies and so on. But what has maybe been left a little bit unsaid here is, so if Taiwan's so great, why do we still see this continuing controversy, conflict, and continually fear confrontation in the Taiwan Strait? And so I'd like to talk about how the challenge that Taiwan poses to the PRC's version of its own identity and its own destiny relates to Taiwan's democracy and democratization. So a reason that many people see for why Taiwan is challenging the PRC is that Taiwan has developed an identity that is certainly separate from the identity of the People's Republic of China, but also separate from even a Chinese identity. And I really appreciated James's comments that kind of differentiate between the PRC and China, that China we can think of as a kind of civilization that has existed over time and that is constituted through culture and heritage, rather than strictly being defined by the PRC state that exists in the modern world. But there are folks in Taiwan who not only would reject the idea of Taiwan as part of the People's Republic of China, but would also question whether Taiwan is, in fact, Chinese in that broader and more sort of ethnocultural sense. So in such a context, in a moment where the very definition of what it means to be Taiwanese, or what Taiwan's relationship to other civilizations, other countries, other traditions and cultures in the world is in question, the emergence of democracy in Taiwan can be, I think erroneously, but can be viewed as a problem, right? The danger to all of us of a confrontation, a military confrontation between Taiwan and the PRC, in which the US could well become involved. That danger is sometimes attributed to the fact that, well, now that Taiwan's a democracy, people can talk about independence and they can say things that challenge the PRC deeply, and they can instigate this kind of conflict and confrontation. So what is the connection between identity and democracy, democratization in Taiwan? And how true is it that Taiwan's democracy is kind of what's driving the conflict between the two sides? So I'm going to actually go back in history. I'm the last speaker, but I'm going to do a little historical contextualizing, if you don't mind, to talk about the emergence of democracy in Taiwan and how the emergence of democracy related to this identity question. Back in the 1970s, when people in Taiwan began to be very active in promoting democracy on the island for a variety of reasons that we can discuss in the Q&A if you'd like. The way people understood kind of the obstacle to democracy was the obstacle to democracy in Taiwan, the obstacle to freedom, and the obstacle to this kind of full participation of the majority of the population in the government of the island. The obstacle was what I would call the China within Taiwan. So the Chinese identity, the Chinese definition of Taiwan that came with the nationalists, with the Republic of China government to Taiwan at the end of World War II. So prior to World War II, for 50 years, Taiwan had been a colony of the Empire of Japan. And so for Taiwanese alive at the time the Republic of China came to Taiwan, the question of their identity was quite complicated already. And the arrival of the ROC, which kind of came in with guns blazing for many years, and even when the kind of blazing settled down to a kind of slow burn, there were decades of authoritarian repression in Taiwan, much of it targeting the long-term population, the 85% of people on the island who had been there before the nationalists ever got there. So there was this sense that, you know, they came from the other side, they came from China, they call themselves Chinese, and they are imposing themselves on us. They're insisting on being not only our government, but also insisting on defining for us what it means to be Chinese. So the nationalists changed the language. They changed the names of all the streets and towns. They changed the definition of what it meant to be a Chinese in Taiwan. And so that created a couple of phenomena. One was a lot of Taiwanese people said, well, I guess I'm not Chinese because these guys who are claiming to defend or to define what Chinese is, say I'm not really Chinese. And also I don't want to be Chinese because being Chinese means being under the authoritarian rule of the Republic of China. So initially the relationship between identity and democracy was, we need a democracy so that our identity is no longer subordinate to the form of Chinese identity and the goals of Chinese identity, including recovering the mainland for the Republic of China that's being imposed on us by this nationalist government. However, after Taiwan democratized over the course of really the 1980s and early 90s, I think for many Taiwanese, that agenda kind of diminished in importance because now Taiwan was democratic, self-governing. The necessity to separate from China, so not from the PRC, but from the idea of China, that necessity became less acute because it was possible to have democracy within the Republic of China on Taiwan. But what happened next was the PRC became the obstacle to Taiwan's self-expression, embodiment of a Taiwanese identity, and to democracy itself. So today, if in the past, the obstacle to Taiwan's identity and self-government and self-actualization, to use a little bit of a new agey term, was the Nationalist Party. But after democratization, then the obstacle became the Chinese Communist Party on the mainland. And I think in both cases, what has happened is that Chinese nationalism, unfortunately, has become the enemy of democracy. So not so much the enemy of identity, but the enemy of democracy. So looking at Taiwan today, what we see is a Taiwan where the real definition, the sort of critical aspect or feature of Taiwanese society and Taiwan as a self-governing political entity in the world, the critical attribute that Taiwanese need and want to maintain is not so much, something kind of ethnic or cultural, but is their democracy. So it goes to things that Chun-Yi was talking about, the civic activism to protect Taiwan from anti-democratic Chinese nationalism, both within Taiwan and coming at Taiwan from across the Taiwan Strait. This is what Taiwanese really want to defend. And so I don't think that identity is the obstacle or is the instigator of conflict across the Taiwan Strait, or at least Taiwanese identity is not the instigator, but Chinese nationalism and the demand in the PRC by the Chinese Communist Party leadership that Taiwan must accept not only a cultural identity as being part of the Sinophone world, the Chinese-speaking, Chinese heritage world, but also a political identity as part of the People's Republic of China. These are the real instigators of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And what I think most Taiwanese want is to be left alone. And the difficulty is that the PRC finds it very difficult to live with that expectation on the other side. So I'm going to wrap it up there, but I'm happy to talk more about sort of the policy implications of all of this and where the US fits in as you are interested. Thank you.
Firstly, but thank you so much for that about identity, nationalism, and those sort of pressures coming there. But I would like to ask you a question on behalf of Rimjin Sud, who sent in a question there. I'm not quite sure my interpretation of it, so I'm just going to read it out because you were talking about identity so brilliantly. Why has Taiwanese identity risen at the same time as the island's defense readiness has decreased?
Indeed. It's an intriguing puzzle. I think the reason that Taiwan's defense readiness was as high as it was in the decades immediately after the war was that it was a military dictatorship, right? The KMT, the Nationalist Party, came from the mainland in 1949, having lost the Chinese Civil War, with hundreds of thousands of men under arms. In fact, one of the major challenges of the early decades was to figure out what to do with all these soldiers, single men in many cases who had come to Taiwan to kind of maintain order there or had evacuated to Taiwan in the face of the military pressure and then got stuck there. Everybody was expecting that they would all go back. So I think in some ways we could say Taiwan's military readiness was artificially high in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and that the identity of the ROC state, which was so heavily connected to the idea of its military virtue and to the ambition of recovering the mainland, caused the nationalists to spend a lot on the military. But as Taiwan has become democratic, then the society can articulate the demands for other kinds of government goods and services. And that has made it very difficult for Taiwan to sustain that high level of military spending.
That's a great answer for that question. I just wanted to, before I've got a question to go around the whole panel, but you made a very good point, Shelley Rigger, about the supply chains for the communications industry compared to supply chains for Ukrainian food exports. Could you just give us that in a nugget?
Yeah, this was in response to something one of the earlier speakers was asked. How are Ukraine and Taiwan different? And I think one of the challenges actually for American policymakers right now, and I think part of the reason that some American policymakers are doing what I would consider to be provocative things that worry me, Nancy Pelosi, I'm speaking to you, is that they feel a need to convince Taiwanese that the US would defend Taiwan more strongly than it has defended Ukraine. And, the tragedy to me is I think we all thought Ukraine was economically unimportant. I had no idea that Ukraine was such an important exporter of food, not to Russia or to its immediate neighbors, but globally, and especially in food threatened parts of Africa. So I think what is a sad reality is that exporting food that people depend on to survive is less of a sort of geopolitical interest to countries like the United States and many others than exporting communications technology, which is certainly very, very important. But I could live without this machine that I'm talking to you through
We'd miss you.
For months. But, take away my food supply and I'm out of here in a matter of weeks.
Yeah.
So, but I think that's just the sad reality of the priorities that
thank you for that.
International relations.
That brings us on to a question from Philip Bowman that I want to quickly put around the whole panel before we go to Barry Gardner, starting at the beginning again with Shirley. Philip Bowman, which lessons might the PRC and the US learn from the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And if you could couch your answers, of course, through the Taiwan prism, which lessons might the PRC and the US learn from the Russian invasion of Ukraine? If Shirley Lynn could give us a first thought on that, and just very briefly, because we've only got about 5 minutes. Shirley, you're quiet.
Hello?
Hi, yes.
Hi.
Yep.
Technical difficulty. Apologies. I really mess up today. Lessons for China from the Ukraine crisis. I think it's very clear that, as Shelley says, of course, the parallel is very confounding, if you will. Taiwan is a vibrant democracy that is a high-income society and has challenges much more similar to other high-income societies, whether in the European Union, in the West. And there are many similarities between the United States and Taiwan, for example. So I think from China's point of view, Russia's relationship with Ukraine has some cultural similarities, but the governance challenges and the resilience, as I talked about in my remarks, is entirely different. Taiwan is a resilient and innovative community, society, and I think that is something that is entirely different in comparison.
Thank you. James Lee?
There's not going to be a lot of nuance to my response to this question. Is that trying to invade another country is not nearly as easy as dictators think it's going to be. And for Beijing looking at this, they would be throwing their forces into which are untested, have no war is a theoretical concept. They have no practical experience of fighting a war. Attempting a naval operation across the strait against the United States, Japan, Australia, and Taiwan. If Putin has failed to take over Ukraine, I mean, China's likelihood of taking over Taiwan is much lower. I think
much lower. Chun-Yi Lee?
Yeah, I just on this point, just to also respond to Shelley's a point about the food and semiconductor experts. I think the reason that the geopolitics focus more on the semiconductor or electronic product is the difficulty to reproduce that. I agree that without bread, without all those grains, that one may not last for a few weeks, but you can find other things like rice, for instance, but you can't find similarity for the semiconductor that Taiwan is produced. That's why Taiwan, in my view, that is more being emphasized by the geopolitics.
Okay, that's a good, subtle, not very nice answer though. Simona, Grano?
No, I know.
Well, maybe from the side of China, I would just say that apart from learning tactically how to avoid the Russian mistakes, which is something that many of us have already commented on in order to, frighteningly so probably do it better than the Russian, hopefully not. I would say that, again, from the perspective of China, I think the surprise and something they're learning is that maybe what they thought was a defunct cooperation between the US and Europe is actually not that defunct, right? And so that there is hope that the Western world is finally realizing, hopefully they will sustain this and not just in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that we can, stand up or try at least to do that in order to defend our values. And this is something I think was previously forgotten for a while.
Okay. Thank you. Raymond Guo, I've got a different question for you. A very quick answer, please. Might the Chinese take places like Dongsha or Taiping in the Spratly Islands or Jinmin instead of taking the whole island to make a point?
Right. That is the kind of big question. I think I tend to be doubtful of that. Just because you look at the lessons of Ukraine, Ukraine had 8 years to prepare for a Russian invasion. Russia invaded Crimea. Taking one of the outlying islands would be the same sort of shock to Taiwanese society to get them really serious about defending their country. I tend to think that if an invasion is going to happen, it's just going to all happen at once. They're not going to,
not going to be salami sliced.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's okay. Thank you for that. And Shelley Rigger, to sum us up, the Taiwan. The role in the continuing world order. Just give us a final thought on that.
So I want to address the previous question because here's what I think the U.S. needs to learn from the Ukraine conflict. I cannot say with certainty that it is what the U.S. is learning. The first part definitely is. One thing that the U.S. has definitely learned from the invasion of Ukraine is that this can happen. This is not a conceptual, abstract possibility. Land wars are not a thing of the past in the 21st century, right? But here's what I think the U.S. needs to learn, and I hope the U.S. focuses on. We must deter an invasion of Taiwan, because no matter what, Taiwan is the target. Taiwan is the battlefield. Taiwan pays the price. And when you watch the news footage from Ukraine, what I take from that is we cannot allow this to happen. And deterrence requires resolve and capability, but it also requires reassurance. So the US needs to be very careful not to create the impression that it is somehow pushing Taiwan toward taking an action that could actually provoke the PRC, because then our deterrence will have failed.
Thank you very much for that great summing up for us. And now, and thank you all our panelists. Now is the time to pass the baton onto the Democracy Forum chair, Barry Gardner, MP, who knows a lot about this topic, and he is really going to sum up what he has heard over the past couple of hours. Barry, over to you.
Humphrey, you say it's a baton. It's more like one of those puzzles where you have to fit the tiles all into the right space to get the complete picture, I'm afraid. Look, let me begin by saying what Charles set out at the start. He painted a pretty gloomy picture. He quoted the rising tension in the Taiwan Straits, that a Chinese attack on Taiwan in the next 6 years was a high probability. He quoted, the statement that if you want confrontation, we'll fight to the end. So it was a pretty gloomy start, I thought, to saying, goodness me, is this actually inevitable? Is it inevitable that there will be military conflict here? He said that US policy needed to be consistent, to be focused on supporting Taiwan for its own sake, and not simply as a tool to try and leverage against China to undermine China, either strategically or in trade terms. Shirley came in and said, look, it's not just an external threat here. She took that focus away from the military and said, look, there are real internal threats going on. The population decline, the power generation problem with not enough renewables and sustainable power, the political polarization, the pandemic. She spoke of that news to me, and I was surprised to find out that Taiwan had the lowest fertility in the world, and that had been in inverse proportion to the rising income. Really some interesting stuff here. And she also said that would lead to the population declining from what I think is about 24 million at the moment to 8.6 million by 2065. That is a huge decline in population. And so I think her claim that really there are some serious internal threats to Taiwan was she made the case very powerfully there, as well as talking about the political polarization and the parochial nature and not having enough of a global outlook, and the way she said it needed creative ways to engage with the world other than via discussion about its relationship with the PRC. Let's move to James. He was very definitive right at the start, which is always helpful. Yes, he said Taiwan is key. And he said, because it's the test of the international community's resolve to stop annexation by force. And he expounded the history of Taiwan being restored to China. You know, he was the first to pose really the question of who is the People's Republic of China? Who is China? This identity question. He said that the legal status of Taiwan was undetermined in the international community, and that Japan relinquished Taiwan but did not cede sovereignty back to Beijing. And that sort of struck me when you were asking that question at the end, Humphrey, lessons from Ukraine. I sort of wrote down in the margin there, first thing I wrote was land costs. Land costs you. If you want more land, you're going to have to pay for it, and you'll pay for it financially, but you may pay for it in lives as well. But the other thing that really struck me was the breakup of the Soviet Union is 30 years old. China and Taiwan have been separated, or the PRC and Taiwan have been separated right from 1895. And it seems to me that is a huge separation in time, which allows cultures and societies to grow apart in a way that, you could say Ukraine has not yet had that amount of time. But that history lesson that James gave us made me ponder that actually this is a huge time scale of separation of, if you have to go back to the fork. So Chun-Yi spoke on trade and the digitalization of Taiwan, the semiconductors, again, some really striking facts. 53% of semiconductors of global chips market that Taiwan has. And that's a huge jump down to the second place of South Korea of 16% that she acknowledged. So she spoke of a huge investment in people and the importance of stable continuity of production in the semiconductor market in Taiwan. And that difference between, yes, the supply chains were integrated with mainland China, but actually Taiwan still retains the high end rather than the low end, low skill assembly part of that supply chain. Now, Simona Grano spoke about the perception of Taiwan shifting in Europe, but said the relevance of Taiwan has grown. And I think a really important point that I took away from what she said was that the impact that this was having on small states within the European Union, and the importance that they attach to having like-minded partners. The way in which the Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed perception in Europe, and particularly in small states in Europe, about the values of democracy, freedom, rule of law. And again, I came back to this issue of identity, because she pointed out that what Taiwan did was it showed that Chinese values are not incompatible with Western values. And that is a very real threat to the PRC, that you can hold up Taiwan as an example of being Chinese and being pro-Western in your values. Raymond, what critical elements of the international order was the question he posed at the beginning? Territorial sovereignty, constitutional order. He spoke of the Asian political order and the country's support, and the ability to, in terms of one China policy, to accept that Taiwan is part of China without defining what that quite means. But again, focused on the sovereignty of small states, that how concerned they were about the relationship, and also the economic retaliation to maritime infringements. I, at this point, wrote two things in the margin. One was how astonished I am that in all of our 7 speakers to date, not one had mentioned Hong Kong. I was astonished by that, because Hong Kong is, 32 times smaller than Taiwan. Its population is, 7 million as opposed to 24. And the difficulty that China has experienced in assimilating or re-assimilating Hong Kong after a period of 50 years, and comparing that with the difficulty that they would have in trying to annex Taiwan, I thought that would be an obvious strategic point for someone to raise, and I was surprised that it wasn't. I also noted down marriage. It's very difficult to keep somebody in a relationship with you if that person doesn't want to be in a relationship with you. We're looking at this with the whole independence question of Scotland and the UK at the moment. How possible is it to maintain the union in the UK? And this is not with the this is after 300 years of being a united country. So this question of who people are or who they feel they are, and whether they're prepared to relinquish that sense of identity, was something that I thought Shelley took up really huge cudgels on behalf of. What is generating the fear in China of the existence of Taiwan, I thought was an interesting way of posing this question. The challenge that Taiwan poses to the PRC's own self-understanding. Is that what the PRC finds so difficult to accept, that it shows that there is a different way of being Chinese that does accord with a different set of values of freedom and democracy. And is it that actually China finds difficult to swallow? What does it mean to be Chinese? What's the connection between identity and democracy? And I thought she explored that very well when she spoke of the two different waves of nationalism that the indigenous people of China, of Taiwan, had experienced. First from the KMT, who had been very authoritarian, but were nationalist as well. And then how that had to soften because people didn't like it, didn't accept it. And in the 70s, democracy started being promoted. And now the threat of nationalism is again an authoritarian threat, but it's from the PRC. And again, it is anti-democratic. And therefore, if that change that took place in the 70s has formed a democratic understanding amongst the Taiwanese population of what it means to be Taiwanese and Chinese, then it's very difficult to see how any military invasion of Taiwan by China could possibly be successful. The overwhelming force that would be required, and we've seen the way in which Ukraine has fought back so valiantly against the Russian invasion, when their histories have actually been much more intertwined much more recently. I doubt very much whether it is possible for the sort of annexation that the PRC seems to think it could do of Taiwan. If it doesn't come voluntarily from Taiwan, I don't think it can come at all.
Barry, thank you for that measured, optimistic. Of course, you mentioned Hong Kong, which was meant to be the trial for the one country, two systems, which hasn't quite worked. So there we are. But that's it. Thank you so much. We're out of time. Thank you all for your comments and your questions. And thank you for the panel. Shirley Lin, James Lee, Chun-Yi Lee, Simona Grano, Raymond Guo, Shelley Rigger, for all your insight, argument, and persuasion. Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, Barry Gardner, and all at the Democracy Forum for bringing us together for this fantastic debate. And next month, the Democracy Forum debate is another cracking one on China again. Has the Belt and Road Initiative lost its luster? That's Thursday, August the 25th. Thursday, August the 25th at 2 p.m. London time. Until then, stay involved, stay curious. I look forward to being with you again soon. And goodbye from me, Humphrey Hawksley.
Oh,